A man no widow could conquer until she appeared. The whole town of Red Hollow knew one thing for sure. Cole Mercer was unconquerable. The wealthiest widows, the most powerful women, the most ambitious men, all had failed. But then, one stormy night, a poor tailor quietly mended his tattered coat without asking a penny. And it was that silence that brought down something unbreakable. Like to support this story and comment the name of the city you're viewing. I want to know how far my story has come. Don't leave. The best is yet to come. The storm arrived without much warning, the way the worst things usually did. It started as a low pressure in the northwest, the kind the old-timers in Red Hollow recognized by the way their knees ached and their horses refused to settle. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned a particular shade of yellow-gray that meant business, and by the time the sun should have gone down, there was no telling where the sun was at all. The wind came in hard off the ridge, sharp enough to cut through wool, and it brought with it a driving sleet that turned the main street into a river of mud and ice water within the first hour. Most people were already inside by then. Cole Mercer was not. He had been out since before dawn, the way he always was during the autumn drives, pushing the last of his cattle down from the upper pastures before the freeze locked the high ground solid. He had 3 hands with him: Hector, who was reliable; Denny, who was young and tried too hard; and an older man named Jasper, who never said much but always showed up when it counted. They had managed to get most of the herd through the south gate before the sleet started in earnest, but Cole had gone back up for the stragglers himself, alone, because that was what he did when he thought no one was watching to question it. He made it back to town long after dark. His horse was done. His coat, a heavy canvas duster he'd worn for 11 years, was soaked through at the shoulders and torn along the left side where a branch had caught him during the descent. He was cold in the particular way a man gets cold when the wet gets into him and the wind doesn't let up. Not shivering, not dramatic, just cold in his bones. The kind that doesn't leave until you've slept 2 nights in a warm room. He tied his horse at the livery and paid Cutter's boy to rub her down and give her extra grain, and then he walked up the main street of Red Hollow with his head down and his hands shoved into pockets that weren't doing much good anymore. He wasn't looking for anything. He was heading for his office above the feed store, where he kept a change of clothes and a cot, because the ranch house was 2 miles out, and he wasn't going to make his horse do that tonight. He had one thought in his mind, and that thought was dry socks. He almost walked past the seamstress's shop without noticing the light. It was small. A single oil lamp in the window, steady in a way that meant someone had recently trimmed the wick. The shop itself was narrow, wedged between the assayer's office and a defunct telegraph station that nobody had gotten around to tearing down. The sign above the door read, "Hartwell Alterations," in letters that had been painted by someone who knew what they were doing but hadn't had the best brush to work with. Cole had registered the shop's existence the way he registered most things in town. He knew it was there, knew roughly who ran it, had no particular reason to go in. He stopped because the door was open about 3 inches, which made no sense in weather like this, and because there was light. He pushed the door open. The woman inside looked up from her work table without startling, which was the first thing that struck him. Most people startled when Cole Mercer appeared in a doorway unexpectedly. He was a large man, broad through the chest, with a face that had been weathered by 15 years of frontier living into something that was not exactly unfriendly, but was not exactly welcoming either. He had been told he had the kind of eyes that made people nervous, even when he was in a perfectly good mood. He was not in a perfectly good mood tonight, and he was dripping sleet onto the floorboards. The woman looked at him, looked at the puddle forming around his boots, and said, "Shut the door. You're letting the cold in." He shut the door. She went back to what she was doing, which appeared to be hemming a pair of trousers by lamplight. She was perhaps 25, maybe a year or 2 either side of that. It was hard to tell with someone who worked with her hands, because the work aged the hands faster than the face. Her hair was dark and pulled back practically, not fashionably. She was wearing a work apron over a plain brown dress. She was not beautiful in any way that would have made a painter reach for his brushes, but there was something in the way she held herself that made Cole think she had never once in her life wasted time worrying about whether she was beautiful. "You're bleeding," she said, without looking up. Cole looked at his left hand. There was a cut along the knuckles, small but still seeping, that he hadn't noticed because his hand was too cold to feel much. It's nothing, he said. I didn't say it was something. I said you're bleeding. She glanced up then, briefly, and her eyes moved over the torn side of his coat. That's a significant tear. I know. You can't ride in that. Not tonight. Not in this. She set down the trousers and stood up, and Cole was aware that she was considerably shorter than him, which meant she was looking up at about a 45-degree angle when she addressed him directly. It didn't seem to diminish her any. Take it off. Excuse me? The coat. Take it off. I'll repair the tear. She was already moving to a cabinet on the far wall, pulling out thread and a curved needle. It'll take me 20 minutes if you stop standing there looking at me like I've said something strange. Cole looked at her for a moment. Then he shrugged the coat off his shoulders, which pulled at muscles that were already complaining about the day, and laid it on the end of the work table she indicated. He sat down in the only other chair in the room, a plain wooden thing near the small stove in the corner, and watched her work. She didn't talk. That was the second thing he noticed. Most people, when Cole Mercer sat down in their establishment, felt compelled to fill the silence with something. Flattery, questions about the ranch, comments about the weather, anecdotes about themselves that they imagined he would find interesting. This woman said nothing. She examined the tear, turned the coat to the light, selected her thread, and began stitching with the focused economy of someone who had done this particular motion 10,000 times and did not need to think about it anymore. The stove was warm. The sleet rattled against the window glass. After about 10 minutes, Cole said, "You're Hartwell's daughter." "I'm Hartwell," she said. "The shop is mine." "Your father died 3 years ago, left me the shop and a modest debt, which I've since cleared." She didn't say it with bitterness or pride. She said it the way someone states a fact that is relevant to the conversation and nothing more. Cole nodded. He thought he remembered hearing something about that. He remembered most things, eventually, but he didn't always assign them their proper weight at the time. "You've been open 3 years," he said. 2.5. It took me 6 months to clear the debt and get the supplies in order. She turned the coat over, examined the inside of the tear. "You caught this on something sharp, not a nail. The edge is too clean for a nail. Branch, maybe." "Branch," he confirmed. She nodded and kept stitching. He watched her hands. They were quick and certain, no hesitation, no wasted motion. He had seen surgeons work with less confidence than this woman repaired a coat. "What do I owe you, Shet?" he asked. She glanced up. "I haven't finished yet." "When you finish, then." She seemed to consider this. Not the price, he thought, but whether she wanted to have this conversation at all. "Nothing," she said finally. "It's a bad night. You needed it done." Cole frowned. "I don't take charity." "I didn't offer charity. I offered a repair." She met his eyes then, directly, without the flickering uncertainty he usually saw in people who looked at him straight on. "If it bothers you that much, you can bring me some fence wire next time you're in town. I've been trying to get the back gate to stay latched, and it keeps working loose." Cole stared at her. "Fence wire," he said. "A small roll. Whatever you have extra." She tied off her thread and bit it clean, then held up the coat and turned it toward the lamp. The seam was straight and tight, practically invisible against the canvas. "There. Good as it was." He took the coat from her. He put it on. The tear was gone. Not patched, not covered, genuinely repaired, the kind of work that required both skill and patience. "Thank you," he said. She had already gone back to the trousers. "Watch the knuckles," she said. "Wrap them before you sleep." He stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, though he couldn't have said why. Then he turned and walked back out into the sleet, and the door clicked shut behind him, and the lamp in the window went on burning steadily in the dark. Cole Mercer had come to Red Hollow 11 years ago with a land deed, a string of horses, and exactly enough capital to survive one bad season and not two. He had built the Mercer Ranch from Raw Valley ground up, not inherited, not gifted, not leveraged on someone else's money. He had dug the fence post holes himself in the first years, strung his own wire, broken his own horses, taken his own losses when the losses came. He was 38 now, and the ranch ran 300 head across 400 acres of the best grazing land in the valley. His neighbors respected him. His competitors watched him carefully. His bank balance was the kind of number that made certain kinds of people think about him differently than they had before they knew it. All of this meant that Cole Mercer was considered, by a wide margin, the most eligible man in Red Hollow, and for a good 40 miles in every direction. And all of this meant that the last 11 years had included, as a persistent and ongoing feature of his existence, women who wanted to marry him. He understood it. He wasn't naive about what he represented. To a widow with children and a failing property, he was security. To an ambitious woman from a family with social standing but diminishing resources, he was consolidation. To the daughters of the merchant class who had read too many novels, he was a certain archetype, the stoic rancher redeemed by love, that particular story that got told over and over in 100 different forms. He had nothing against any of them. He found some of them genuinely interesting people. But he had a reliable instinct for the difference between interest and purpose, and when he looked at the women who positioned themselves around him, the carefully orchestrated encounters, the invitations, the dinners at which he somehow always ended up seated next to someone's recently widowed sister, he could never quite turn off the part of his mind that noticed the machinery of it. He didn't want to be someone's solution. He wasn't sure what he wanted exactly. He had stopped examining that question closely sometime around his 35th year, when it had seemed more productive to focus on what was in front of him and less productive to think about what was missing. Margaret Hollis was the first to comment on it, as she commented on most things first. Margaret was 52, twice widowed, and ran the largest dry goods operation in Red Hollow from a combination of genuine business acumen and a social instinct so finely tuned that it functioned almost like a weapon. She had pursued Cole in her own way for 3 years, not clumsily, not overtly, but with the patient precision of someone who understood that direct approaches didn't work on that particular man and had decided to outflank him instead. She was in the post office when Cutter's boy mentioned, to no one in particular, that he'd seen Cole Mercer's horse at the livery late last night, and that Cole had walked up the street in the storm and gone into the Hartwell shop and stayed there for a good while. Margaret filed this information away without visibly reacting to it. 2 days later, she mentioned it to Dorothea Sims, whose ranch bordered Cole's to the east, and who had also had aspirations in that direction, in the private but not quite quiet way that ensured it would circulate. "The Hartwell girl," Dorothea said, and her voice did something at the edges that was not quite contempt, something more like the particular scorn one reserves for competition that shouldn't exist. "She barely makes rent. I heard she's been taking in mending from the miners." "She probably is," Margaret said, neutrally. "What on earth would Cole Mercer want with someone like that?" "He was cold and his coat was torn," Margaret said. "Let's not make it into something it isn't." But she said it in a tone that suggested she was making it into exactly what she said it wasn't, and Dorothea understood this perfectly. Cole came back with the fence wire 4 days later. He arrived in the late afternoon when the light was going flat and golden the way it did in October, and knocked at the back door of the shop, where the small enclosed yard held what appeared to be a failing gate and a neat stack of firewood that had been split by someone who knew what they were doing. Eliza opened the door, registered the coil of wire in his hand, and stepped back to let him through. "Back left post," she said. "The staple's pulled out." He went to look at it. She was right. The post had shifted slightly in the frost heave, and the wire had worked loose from 3 of the staples, which meant the whole tension was off. It was a 20-minute job if you had the right tools and didn't mind the cold. "You have pliers?" he asked. She went inside and came back with pliers and a small hammer. She didn't offer to help or hover. She went back inside, and through the window he could see her at her work table, the lamp already lit against the early dark. He fixed the gate properly, re-drove the post, re-stapled the wire at the correct tension, added 2 additional staples at the stress points. He tested it 4 times before he was satisfied. When he knocked at the back door to return the tools, she opened it and looked past him at the gate. "That's more than I asked for," she said. "It would have come loose again by spring if I'd just re-stapled it." She looked at the gate a moment longer. "Thank you," she said, and took the tools from him. He should have left then. He had work to get back to. He always had work to get back to. But something made him say, "Is the inside latch working?" Sometimes when the post shifts, the hardware on the door itself gets racked. She considered this, then pushed the door open wider. "Come look." The inside latch was fine, as it turned out, but the hinges on the back door of the shop itself had worked loose from the frame, and while Cole was looking at those, he noticed that the small window above the work table had a crack running across the lower pane that would let cold air in all winter. "That needs glazing," he said. "I know, I haven't gotten to it. I can bring putty next time I'm in town." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Mercer." "Cole." "You repaid the coat repair with the fence wire. You don't owe me anything further." "I know I don't." He held her gaze. "But the window will be a problem by January." She seemed to weigh this. She had, he noticed, a quality of stillness that was very different from passivity. She wasn't hesitant or uncertain. She was simply taking her time, which was different. Most people around Cole either pushed or retreated. She did neither. "All right," she said finally, "if you happen to have putty." He came back with putty 3 days after that and stayed long enough to reglaze the window properly, and while he was doing it, Eliza made coffee and set a cup on the corner of the work table without comment, and he drank it without comment, and they were both comfortable in the quiet in a way that Cole would think about later, privately, with a kind of wondering. He had been comfortable in silence with men he trusted, with Hector, with old Jasper. He had not been particularly comfortable in silence with women, because in his experience, silence with women was never quite silence. It was always charged with something, expectation or calculation, or the particular tension of a test being administered. This was different. This was just quiet. He came back again a week later for reasons that were less and less about fence wire. But Red Hollow noticed. Red Hollow always noticed. It was a town of 340 people in a valley that didn't offer much in the way of entertainment, which meant that human behavior served as the primary spectator sport and was observed with the same focused attention that more populated places gave to theater. Cole Mercer had been Red Hollow's primary subject for years, and his apparent interest in Eliza Hartwell, appearing at her shop not once or twice, but repeatedly, the two of them seen talking in the street, Cole's horse tied outside Hartwell Alterations on a Tuesday afternoon when there was no obvious reason for him to be in town at all, was analyzed, discussed, and interpreted with considerable energy. The interpretations were not kind. In the better parlors and at the better dinner tables, the consensus formed quickly and with the particular certainty of people who have already decided what they believe and are now selecting evidence to support it. Eliza Hartwell was poor. She was unremarkable. She had no family connections of consequence, no property, no social standing. She was, by every measure that Red Hollow used to assess the worth of women, insufficient. What she was doing, what she must be doing, was maneuvering. She saw her opportunity, Dorothea Sims said, at a gathering at Margaret Hollis's house that was ostensibly a quilting circle but functioned primarily as a council of war. A man comes in out of the cold and she gets her hooks into him. It's transparent. "Cole's not a fool," said one of the younger women cautiously. "No, but he's a man," Margaret said, with the authority of someone who had been married to two of them. And men have particular blind spots when it comes to women who seem not to want anything from them. It reads as virtue when it's actually just a more sophisticated strategy. There were nods around the table. What none of them said, because none of them would have admitted it even to themselves, was that they were afraid. Not of Eliza specifically, but of what she represented. The possibility that everything they understood about how worth was established and recognized and rewarded might not apply to Cole Mercer. That a man who had rebuffed wealth and position and beauty might be reached by something they had not thought to offer because they had not thought it mattered. Eliza became aware of the shift in the town's attitude gradually, and then all at once. The first sign was small. Mrs. Pemberton at the dry goods, who had previously been perfectly pleasant in the transactional way of a shopkeeper with a regular customer, was somehow always busy when Eliza came in, and somehow always required her to wait longer than seemed strictly necessary. The second sign was the credit. Eliza had a small line of credit at Pemberton's, established over 2 years of reliable payment. She needed a spool of silk thread, the fine kind, for a wedding dress alteration she had been commissioned to do, which represented more money than she usually saw from a single job. The thread was not expensive. She had bought it on credit a dozen times. "I'm afraid your account is overextended," Mrs. Pemberton said without meeting her eyes. Eliza looked at her. I paid the balance 2 weeks ago. The account's been reviewed. Mrs. Pemberton straightened a display of buttons that didn't need straightening. Policy. Eliza considered arguing. She looked at the woman's set jaw, the slight pink in her neck that meant she knew perfectly well this was wrong and was doing it anyway, and understood that argument would accomplish nothing. She bought the thread from the general store 2 streets over, which sold a slightly inferior grade, and added a mental note to adjust her pricing on the wedding dress alteration to account for the material compromise. She did not mention it to Cole. This was both instinct and decision. Her instinct was that talking about it felt like asking for something, and she didn't ask for things. Her decision was that whatever was happening between her and Cole Mercer was fragile, in the way that new things are fragile, not weak, but not yet strong enough to have weight put on it. And she was not going to be the person who turned it into a problem before it had a chance to become what it might become. She was also, though she would not have used this word for it, angry. Not the hot, visible kind of anger. She had learned young that the hot kind was a luxury she couldn't afford, but the cold, banked kind that sits in the chest and burns clean and slow and does not go out. She had worked for 2.5 years. She had paid her debts. She had not asked anything from anyone that she wasn't prepared to give back in full measure. She had been in every way that the town claimed to value, exactly what the town claimed to value. And it meant nothing, apparently, because she had the wrong kind of nothing to her name. The drought that had been threatening since late summer settled in properly by October's end. It was not a catastrophic drought, not yet, but it was the kind of dry that made cattlemen uneasy and farmers outright scared, the kind that arrived right as the winter forage should have been putting on its last growth, and didn't. The smaller operations felt it first. A family named Croft, who ran 50 head on a section of bottom land west of town, lost 1/3 of their hay supply to blight and found themselves looking at a winter they couldn't afford. Eliza heard about the Crofts through her work. She took in mending from most of the Valley families, which meant she was connected to a network of small conversations and worries that the town's better class rarely heard. She went to see them on a Saturday, riding a borrowed horse because she didn't own one, with 2 loaves of bread and a ham she couldn't really afford in her saddlebag. She didn't go to offer charity. She went because Mrs. Croft had a daughter who needed a dress altered for a school function and had mentioned worrying about it, and Eliza had decided to do the alteration at no charge and to bring bread because people think more clearly about problems when they're not hungry. She spent 4 hours at the Croft place, did the dress, listened to Mr. Croft lay out his winter projections with the focused anxiety of a man running numbers he already knew didn't add up. And by the time she rode back to town, she had a reasonably clear picture of what the winter was going to cost the smaller families and what they didn't have to meet it with. She stopped at 3 other farms on the way back. She was not planning anything, exactly. She was assessing, but the assessment had a momentum to it, and she followed the momentum because that was how she had always worked. You looked at what was in front of you, you figured out what was needed, and you found a way. Cole came by the shop 2 days later and found her at the work table surrounded by paper, lists, figures, names. He looked at the papers. "What's this?" "Winter shortfall," she said. 7 families within riding distance that won't have enough hay to carry their livestock through to March if the cold comes in hard. She turned the main list toward him. "I'm trying to figure out who has surplus and who has deficit, and whether there's a way to move resources before the freeze." Cole pulled up the chair. He had started using the chair by the stove as a matter of course, which neither of them had remarked on, and looked at the list carefully. His eyes moved over it with the particular attention of someone who knows the landscape and the people both. "Jasper Holt has surplus," he said, pointing to a name she hadn't listed. "He sold half his herd early this year and didn't use the hay he'd put up for them. He won't advertise it because he doesn't want people coming to him for favors, but it's there." "How do you know?" "Because Jasper and I have run cattle together for 8 years, and I know his operation as well as my own." He studied the list. "The Crofts are in worse shape than you have here. Tom Croft didn't tell you about the east pasture, so he's too proud. But the grass there failed entirely. How do I get Jasper Holt to sell surplus to people who can't fully pay for it until spring?" Cole looked at her. "Leave Jasper to me." She met his eyes. This isn't your project. No, he said. But Jasper owes me a significant favor from 3 years back, and this is a reasonable use for it. He looked back at the list. Who else have you talked to? She told him. He added 3 names she hadn't reached. They spent the next 2 hours cross-referencing need against available resource across the valley, and by the end of it they had something that looked like a plan, not perfect, not guaranteed, but workable. Cole rolled up the main list and tucked it inside his coat. I'll ride the east side this week. You take the west. I don't have a horse. He looked at her. I'll bring you one. She started to say something about that, about what she did and didn't need from him, and then stopped. Because the truth was she did need a horse for this particular thing, and arguing about it would only slow down the work, and the work was what mattered. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and stood up. At the door he paused with his hand on the frame, the same position he'd stood in that first night, she thought, dripping sleet onto her floor, and said without turning around, You're the only person in this valley who looked at the drought numbers and started making lists. Someone had to, she said. He turned enough to look at her over his shoulder. Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was something in that direction, complicated and a little raw, like something he hadn't taken out and looked at in a long time. Then he left. Eliza sat for a while in the quiet after he was gone, with the lamp burning and the sleet gone now, just cold, clear air against the windows, and thought about that look, and did not let herself make too much of it, because she had learned that making too much of things was how you got hurt, and she had enough problems without adding that particular one. But she thought about it anyway, in the small, careful part of herself that she kept private from everyone, and the thought had warmth in it, and she let it. The horse he brought was a steady gray mare named Flint, which was a strange name for a mare but suited her. She was solid and reliable, and had clearly been well handled, and she moved through the valley roads without fuss in a way that made Eliza's work considerably faster. She spent 4 days covering the west side of the valley, and what she found was both worse and better than the lists had suggested. Worse, because several families had losses they hadn't reported, a small pride of not wanting to be seen as the ones who didn't make it, which was a particular kind of frontier stubbornness that Eliza recognized and did not judge, having the same quality in herself. Better, because 2 of the farms she'd written off as purely deficit turned out to have things to offer that weren't hay, labor, tools, a root cellar full of preserved food that was more than one family could use. She came back to town on the 5th evening with a considerably revised set of lists and a new conviction that what the valley needed was not charity, but coordination. Cole came by the shop that night. He had been doing the same on the east side, and his additions to the map were significant. Jasper Holt's surplus was larger than expected, and there were 2 other ranchers who had more stored grain than they'd admitted to publicly for reasons of their own. They sat across from each other at the work table, their papers spread between them, talking through the logistics, and at some point Eliza looked up and caught Cole looking at her, not at the papers, at her, with an expression that was unguarded in a way she had not seen on his face before. He looked away immediately, back to the papers. She looked back at the papers too. Neither of them said anything about it. Outside, the first hard freeze of the season crept down from the ridge and laid itself across the valley floor, and the windows grew pale with frost, and inside the small shop the lamp burned steady and warm, and the work went on. It was Margaret Hollis who said it out loud first, at a dinner that Cole attended and Eliza did not. The dinner was at the Sims house, 6 of the valley's established families, the kind of gathering where business got done under the cover of social occasion. Cole went because he had always gone, because these were his neighbors, and he was not by nature someone who ignored his neighbors. Over the second course, Margaret said, "People are talking about your arrangement with the Hartwell woman, Cole." The table went quiet in the careful way of people who have been waiting for someone else to say the thing they've all been thinking. Cole set down his fork. "What arrangement is that?" "The horse. The time you've been spending." Margaret's voice was pleasant, which was how she was most dangerous. "People are concerned that you may be making a mistake." "People," Cole said. "Friends," Margaret said. "People who care about you and about this valley's future." She let that settle for a moment. "She's a seamstress, Cole. She has nothing. Whatever she's convinced you she is, the practical reality..." She's currently coordinating hay distribution for 7 families who would otherwise lose livestock this winter, Cole said, in a tone that was entirely flat. She did it without being asked, without making noise about it, and without expecting anything back. I can't think of a single person at this table who has done anything comparable this season. He picked up his fork again. I don't need advice on who to spend my time with, but thank you. The dinner continued. Margaret did not pursue it further. But Cole drove home that night in the cold with something settled in him that had been unsettled for a long time, a feeling like a compass needle that had been spinning, finding north. He wasn't certain yet what it meant. He was 38 years old and had gotten along fine without being certain about things like this, and he wasn't going to rush it. But the compass needle had found north, and he was going to let it stay there and see what happened next. The hay distribution came together by mid-November, imperfect and patched together, the way real solutions always are. Jasper Holt's surplus moved west in 3 wagon loads. A grain-sharing arrangement between 2 families who had never particularly liked each other got brokered over a fence line and 2 cups of bad coffee, and the Crofts made it into winter with enough forage to carry their remaining herd through to March if the cold didn't run longer than expected. Nobody called it a success out loud because nobody wanted to jinx it, but the numbers worked, and that was what mattered. Eliza returned Flint to Cole's ranch on a gray Thursday morning, riding out the 2 miles herself and handing over the reins at the fence gate where Hector was replacing a section of post. "She's a good horse," Eliza said. Hector took the reins and looked at Eliza with the particular careful neutrality of a man who likes someone but has decided it's not his place to say so. "Mr. Mercer's up at the north barn if you want to tell him yourself." "I don't need to," Eliza said. "Just that she's back and she's sound." She walked back to town. It was 4 miles round trip, and her boots were not ideal for it, but she'd made worse walks for less reason, and the cold air was clean and the valley was quiet in the way it got before snow, a held-breath kind of silence that she had always found more settling than unsettling. Cole came by the shop that evening anyway. He didn't have a reason, or rather, he had the thin cover of reason that he'd been using for weeks now, some question about the distribution records she'd kept, whether the Fielding family on the northwest corner had confirmed their grain share. The question took about 4 minutes to answer. He stayed for 2 hours. They talked about the valley, mostly, the coming winter, the water table, a rumor about a land surveyor who'd been seen riding the eastern ridge without explanation. Cole had opinions about the surveyor that were pointed and specific. Eliza listened and asked questions that made him think harder about what he actually knew versus what he was assuming, which was, he had come to realize, one of her more irritating and valuable qualities. He left at 9 o'clock and walked back to his horse in the dark. And if he was aware that he was smiling slightly at nothing in particular, he chose not to examine that too closely. What he did not know, walking back through Red Hollow's quiet main street, was that he had been watched leaving, that the watching had been deliberate, and that by morning the watching would have become a story, and the story would have become a judgment, and the judgment was not going to be kind to Eliza. Margaret Hollis was not a cruel woman in the way that some people are cruel. She did not enjoy suffering for its own sake, but she was a woman who had spent 30 years building and protecting a particular kind of order, and she understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has survived 2 husbands and a cattle depression. That order required maintenance. It required people to stay in their designated places. And Eliza Hartwell, with her work-roughened hands and her unlacquered furniture and her 2.5 years of cleared debt, was not staying in her designated place. Margaret didn't make speeches. She made comments, small, precise, placed carefully in the right conversations with the right people, and then left to do their work the way you leave seeds in ground and come back to find things growing. The comment she made about the credit at Pemberton's Dry Goods had been one such seed. The conversation she'd had with 3 of the valley's merchant wives about the impropriety of a young unmarried woman receiving a man in her shop after dark, that was another. She didn't say anything untrue, technically. She said things that were true but incomplete, true but framed, true in the way that a portrait can be an accurate rendering and still be designed to make the subject look foolish. Within 2 weeks of Cole's dinner at the Sims house, Eliza's work had slowed in ways she couldn't immediately account for. The wedding dress alteration was the clearest example. The commission had come from a family named Breckett. Not wealthy, but solidly middle of the valley's social structure, the kind of family whose opinion tracked with whoever had the most momentum at any given moment. The mother had come in personally, examined Eliza's work samples, agreed on a price, and left a deposit. She came back 6 days later and asked for the deposit back. "We've decided to go to Hartsville for the work," she said, not meeting Eliza's eyes. Hartsville was 30 miles away, and its seamstress charged considerably more. "It's nothing personal." Eliza counted out the deposit coins from her cash box and handed them over. She did not ask why, because she already knew the shape of why, even if she didn't have the specifics, and asking would not change anything. "Good luck with the dress," she said. Mrs. Breckett left quickly, the way people do when they're ashamed of themselves, but not quite ashamed enough to change course. Eliza sat with the depleted cash box for a moment, doing quiet arithmetic. The wedding commission would have covered January's rent and most of February's supplies. Without it, she was going to need to take on more mending, the lower margin work, miners' shirts and farmers' dungarees, the work she'd done when she first opened and had been slowly moving away from as her reputation for finer alterations built. She pulled out her ledger and started revising her winter projections. It was not pleasant arithmetic, but it was manageable. She had been in tighter spots than this. What she had not been in, or at least not since she was a child and understood it differently, was a situation where the tightness was being manufactured by other people on purpose. The second refusal came from a neighboring shop, Caldwell, the cobbler, who shared a wall with her and with whom she had always maintained a polite and occasionally useful relationship. He sent her customers who needed stitching work. She sent him customers who needed resoling. He stopped her in the alley one morning with a pained expression that she recognized as the face of a man who has already decided to do something he doesn't feel good about. "I have to ask you not to send people to me," he said, "through that arrangement we had." Eliza looked at him. He was 60, had a bad hip, and had been kind to her father when her father was sick. She had always liked him more than she let show. "Why?" He looked at his boots. "I've had some conversations. People have said things about—" He stopped, restarted. "It's nothing to do with your work." "I know it isn't. I've got a lease renewal coming up. Hollis owns the building." He said it like a confession. "I can't afford to—" Another stop. "I'm sorry, Miss Hartwell. I truly am." Eliza thought about saying several things. She said none of them. "I understand," she said instead, which was true. She did understand. Understanding something and accepting it as right were different things, but the distinction wasn't useful here. She went back inside and took stock of what she actually had. 3 steady mending customers who were too far outside the town's social structure to be reached by Margaret Hollis's influence. A mine foreman's wife, 2 families out past the Eastern Ridge who barely came to town and didn't care about its opinions. She had her skills. She had a sewing machine that was hers outright, paid for 2 years ago. She had the basic raw truth that people needed clothes altered and repaired regardless of what social games their betters were playing. It was enough to keep going. Probably. If she was careful. What she was not going to do was talk about it. Cole noticed something was wrong before she said anything, which she hadn't planned to say anything, so the noticing itself was the problem. He came by on a Wednesday with no particular cover story this time. He had apparently decided to stop pretending he needed one, and sat down in the chair by the stove and watched her work for about 10 minutes before he said, "What happened?" "Nothing happened. I'm hemming trousers." "You've hemmed 3 inches off that same leg twice. You're thinking about something else." Eliza looked at the trousers. He was right. She'd gotten distracted and overcorrected, and now she was going to have to let the hem down and start over, which meant the job would take longer than she'd priced it for. She set the trousers down. "The Breckett family took their commission back," she said, "and Caldwell asked me to stop the referral arrangement. Hollis owns his building." Cole was quiet for a moment. His face had gone still in the particular way it went still when he was deciding something. "How bad is it?" "Manageable." She picked up the trousers again. "I've adjusted my projections." "I could—" "No." She said it without harshness, but without any give in it either. "I'm not going to take money from you. That's not what this is." "I wasn't going to offer money. I was going to say, I could ask around about whether there are people who need work done that aren't going to Hollis's people for their opinion of you. Eliza considered this. It was a real offer, practically useful, not charity. All right, she said, if it comes up naturally. Not if you have to push for it. Cole nodded. There was a beat of silence in which the stove ticked and outside someone's wagon went by on the frozen street, and then Cole said, "She's doing this because of me. You know that. I know that. I can talk to her." "And say what?" Eliza looked at him directly. "Tell her to leave me alone because you've decided you like me? That makes it worse. That makes me the woman who needs Cole Mercer to fight her battles, which is exactly the story she wants." Cole looked at her for a long moment. "You've thought about this?" "I think about most things." He sat back in the chair, and she could see him working through it. The same quality she'd noticed in him from the beginning, that he actually engaged with problems rather than running over them. He didn't like what she was saying, but he was hearing it. "The drought work you did," he said finally. 7 families know what you did. That's not nothing. 7 families who are currently worried about their hay supply and their livestock and their winter costs. They're not thinking about me. Some of them are. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Tom Croft told me last week that you'd done his daughter's dress and wouldn't take payment. He said it like he was still trying to figure out what to do with that." Eliza was quiet. "He'll remember," Cole said. "People remember things like that. Not right away, maybe. But they remember." She wanted to say that remembering later didn't pay January rent. She didn't say it, because it was true, but it was also the kind of thing you said when you wanted someone to feel bad for pointing out something hopeful, and Cole had said it with honesty, and she didn't want to punish him for honesty. "Maybe," she said instead. He stayed another hour. When he left, he paused at the door. That same pause, she thought, that he always made, like a man who has learned to stop and look before stepping out into weather. "I'm going to the Ridge Survey tomorrow," he said. "That surveyor people have been seeing. I want to know who commissioned him. Let me know what you find." He looked at her with that unguarded expression again, the one that appeared sometimes without warning. "I usually do," he said, and left. Eliza sat for a long while after the door closed, in the quiet and the lamplight, turning that sentence over in her hands like something she'd found and wasn't sure yet what to do with. "I usually do." 2 words that meant nothing and somehow meant a great deal, because what they meant was that he considered her the person he told things to. Not a convenience, not a charity case, not a woman to be managed or courted in the formal sense that Red Hollow understood courting. The person he told things to. She thought about what Margaret Hollis was afraid of, really. Not Eliza Hartwell specifically, but the idea of her. The idea that worth might be measured differently than the town's ledger allowed. That a woman could matter to a man like Cole Mercer, not because of what she brought to the balance sheet, but because of who she was when she wasn't trying to be anything. It didn't make the lost commission come back. It didn't fix the referral arrangement with Caldwell or make Mrs. Pemberton less deliberately slow at the counter. But it was something to know. It was something to carry into the winter that was coming, with its frozen ground and its long silences and the particular kind of hard that she had learned to be ready for. She picked up the trousers, let down the hem she'd gotten wrong, and started over. The surveyor's name was Aldrich, and he worked for a company called Consolidated Valley Partners, which was registered in a city 400 miles away and had no visible office, no listed principals, and a name that sounded substantial while meaning nothing at all. Cole found this out in 3 days of riding and asking questions that most people didn't want to answer. He found it out by talking to the surveyor's horse handler, who had loose lips and a taste for whiskey, and had mentioned, without quite realizing what he was saying, that Aldrich had been mapping the eastern ridge and the bottomland water rights along the full length of the valley. Not just one section, all of it. Cole sat with this information for 2 days before he said anything to anyone, because he had learned a long time ago that the first thing you do with information that troubles you is not talk about it. It's think about it until you understand its shape. The shape of this one was not good. Water rights on the valley floor controlled grazing access for every ranch from the northern plateau to the southern breaks. Whoever held those rights held a lever on every operation in the valley, including his own. A company that was mapping them systematically was a company that intended to claim them, and a company that had no visible principles was a company that had local help. Someone on the ground who knew which parcels were vulnerable and which landowners were in debt and which county clerks might be persuaded to overlook certain irregularities in the filing process. He went to Eliza. He didn't plan to, exactly. He had planned to go to Hector and then to Jasper Holt and then, maybe, to the county recorder's office to pull the existing water right filings. But he found himself at the door of Hartwell Alterations at 7 in the evening with his notes in his coat pocket, and he knocked, and she opened the door and looked at his face and stepped back to let him in without asking any questions. He laid the notes on her work table and told her what he'd found. She read through them carefully, asked 2 questions that cut directly to the parts he was least certain about, and then sat back and was quiet for a long moment. Consolidated Valley Partners, she said. Who locally would have the knowledge to help a company like that identify which parcels to target? Someone with access to county debt records, Cole said. Someone who knows which families are behind on taxes and which have clear title issues from the original land grants. That's a short list. How short? County recorder, 2 or 3 lawyers, the bank. He paused. And anyone those people talk to regularly. Eliza looked at him. Margaret Hollis banks with Garrett's. So do I. But Margaret is on the Depositors' Council. She sees aggregate lending reports. Eliza turned one of his notes over and looked at the back, which was blank, like she was checking her own thinking against something. I'm not saying it's her. I'm saying it could be someone in that circle. I know. Cole pulled out the one piece of paper he hadn't laid down yet, a rough copy he'd made of a survey marker location, which corresponded to a parcel boundary that, according to the original land grants, should have been public grazing access, but which the markers suggested was being claimed as private. There are 4 markers on ground that isn't anybody's to claim. That's not a survey. That's preparation for a filing. Eliza studied the location notes. Her finger traced the approximate boundary line. That's Tom Croft's water access. If that parcel gets filed on and the access road is considered part of it, he can't get to the creek without trespassing. 11 other families are in the same situation on various points along the valley. Some of them know they have title issues. Most of them don't. They were both quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the particular edge that meant the temperature was dropping again. What are you going to do? Eliza asked. I'm going to pull every water right filing in the county and compare them to the original land grants. If there are discrepancies, forged claims, altered documents, filings that don't match the originals, I'm going to need a lawyer who isn't connected to the local banking circle. There's an attorney in Caldwell County, Eliza said. Hartmore. He did some work for my father on the original lease agreement here. He's not from this valley, and he doesn't have clients here. Cole looked at her. You know a lawyer in Caldwell County? My father was careful about things like that. He said it was good practice to have someone outside the local circle who could look at documents without a personal stake. She said it simply, the way she said most things, without decoration. I can write to him if you want. He'll know what to look for in a filing discrepancy. Do that. She pulled out paper and dipped her pen and began drafting the letter while Cole sat in the chair by the stove and thought about the second problem, which was harder than the first. The first problem was legal. Find the forgeries, document them, bring in outside counsel, challenge the filings. That was work, but it was straightforward work. The second problem was the local help. Whoever was feeding Consolidated Valley Partners their information was someone in Red Hollow's established circle, which meant that exposing the scheme would expose them, which meant that Cole was going to make permanent enemies of people he'd done business with for a decade. People who controlled credit, supply chains, the informal networks that a ranch operation depended on. He could absorb that. His operation was established enough and diversified enough that he could lose a few business relationships and survive it. But he had been watching, the last 2 months, what happened to people who didn't have that cushion. What happened to people in this valley who found themselves on the wrong side of the town's established power structure. He had watched it happen to Eliza over nothing more than the fact that she'd spent evenings in conversation with him, and the thought of what these people would do to the valley's smaller families if they felt cornered and retaliatory was not a comfortable one. Eliza finished the letter and set down her pen. It'll go out on tomorrow's post rider, she said. Hartmore should have it by the end of the week. Good. Cole didn't move from the chair. There's going to be a community meeting, the kind that gets called when someone wants to make a public demonstration of consensus. About what? About me. He said it without ego, matter-of-factly. Hollis will call it, or Sims on her behalf. The pitch will be that I need to consolidate my position by aligning with the Valley's established interests, which means it'll be framed as being about the syndicate threat and what the Valley needs to do in response. But the actual purpose will be to put social pressure on me to formalize things with someone in their circle, establish a partnership that signals where I stand. Eliza was quiet for a moment. A marriage proposal, or something equivalent, a formal business partnership with a widow who has holdings, the optics of me standing with their side of the Valley instead of... He stopped. Instead of mine, she said, without particular emotion. Yes. She looked down at her work table, at the letter she'd just finished writing on his behalf, at the notes spread between them that represented 2 weeks of her time in his. When she looked up, her face had the quality he'd come to recognize. Not closed off, but careful. Processing. What are you going to do? She asked again, but the question meant something different this time. Cole stood up from the chair. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark main street, the lit windows of the establishments that had been cutting Eliza's credit and pulling her commissions and slowly, systematically, trying to make her too small to matter. He had watched it happen and said very little, because she had told him clearly that fighting her battles for her would make things worse, and he had believed her. He had believed her about a lot of things. I'm going to the meeting, he said, and I'm going to say what I actually think. Eliza's expression shifted. Something moved across it that she didn't quite manage to keep neutral. Colt, I know what you're going to say. You'll lose relationships, business connections you've built for years. I know. Margaret Hollis has influence with Garrett's bank. She could make your credit terms complicated. I know that too. Then, Eliza. He turned from the window and looked at her directly. I have watched you spend 2 months getting your credit pulled and your commission stolen and your neighbors turned against you, and you have not bent once, and you have not asked me to do a single thing about it, and you have kept working and kept showing up. The least I can do is show up to a meeting and say the truth out loud. She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp was between them, its light catching the line of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes. You're going to make things harder for yourself, she said. Probably. I don't need you to do this. I know you don't. He picked up his coat from the hook by the door. I'm not doing it because you need it. I'm doing it because it's what's right, and I've been a long time not doing things just because they were right when they were also inconvenient. He paused with his hand on the door. Get some sleep. The letter will keep until morning. He left. Eliza sat still in the lamplight for a while, listening to the sound of his horse moving away down the frozen street, and felt something she had trained herself out of feeling too easily. The particular vulnerability of realizing that someone else's courage on your behalf could undo you faster than any cruelty. She pressed her hands flat on the work table and breathed. Then she folded the letter to Hartmore, sealed it, and went to bed. The meeting was called 4 days later under the auspices of the Red Hollow Valley Association, which was a body that technically existed to coordinate regional interests, but in practice functioned as the social infrastructure of the town's established families. It was held at the Sims house, which had the largest parlor, and attendance was strongly implied to be mandatory for anyone who considered themselves a serious stakeholder in the Valley's future. Cole went. Eliza did not. She had not been invited, and inviting herself would have handed her enemies a gift she had no intention of giving them. She stayed at the shop and worked on a repair job that was due Friday, and tried not to think about the meeting 2 streets away. Cole sat in the second row of chairs and watched the room fill. He counted 22 people. He knew all of them, most of them well. Some of them he genuinely liked. Several of them had been his neighbors for a decade, had worked alongside him in bad seasons, had shared information about water conditions and cattle prices and the particular difficulties of running an operation in a valley that could be brutal. Several of them had also, he now understood, spent the last 2 months systematically dismantling Eliza Hartwell's livelihood. It was possible, he supposed, to hold both of those things true about a person. People were capable of genuine warmth in one direction and genuine cruelty in another, especially when the cruelty had been dressed up as something reasonable sounding like propriety or community standards or concern for the valley's future. Margaret Hollis opened the meeting with remarks about the threat posed by outside speculation and the need for valley solidarity, all of which was true, Cole noted, and all of which was not the actual point of the meeting. The actual point came about 20 minutes in, when Dorothea Sims raised the question of what form that solidarity should take. A united front, Dorothea said, requires that the valley's significant stakeholders be aligned. In interest and in appearance, she let the word settle. It sends a message to outside speculators when the valley's leading figures have clear community commitments, families, partnerships. Several heads nodded. Cole, said a man named Garrett, the banker. You have more standing in this valley than anyone in this room. You know that, and everyone here respects what you've built. But an unmarried man in your position is a signal that the leading interests of this valley might be in flux. Speculators look for that kind of uncertainty. There was a murmur of agreement that Cole recognized as a performance. Not dishonest, exactly. These people had convinced themselves, as people usually did, that what they wanted aligned with what was right. But it was a performance. He let the murmur settle. I appreciate the concern, he said. He said it evenly, without edge, because he wanted to say what he was going to say from a position of steadiness rather than anger. I've been in this valley 11 years. I've seen it flood, and I've seen it burn, and I've seen 3 different waves of outside money try to get their hands on the water rights. The valley survived all of it, not because of who the leading men were married to. Because of people doing the right thing when it was hard. Cole, Garrett started. Let me finish. He said it quietly. Garrett stopped. 2 months ago, a young woman in this town identified a forage shortfall that would have cost 7 families their livestock this winter. She did it on her own time, without being asked, without any expectation of compensation. She coordinated a resource-sharing arrangement that worked. That is the kind of person this valley needs. The room had gone very quiet. I am also aware, Cole continued, that several people in this room have spent those same 2 months making her life materially harder, pulling credit, withdrawing commissions, using building leases as leverage. He looked at Margaret when he said that last part, and Margaret held his gaze with the absolute composure of a woman who had expected this and prepared for it. I understand why, and I'm telling you clearly so there's no ambiguity. It stops. Cole. Margaret's voice was steady, almost kind. You're letting personal feeling cloud your judgment about, I'm aware of what I'm letting. What cloud what? He said. I've thought about it carefully, and I've also spent the last week looking into Consolidated Valley Partners, and I'm going to tell you what I found, because some of you in this room know about it already, and some of you don't, and the ones who don't deserve to know. He laid out what he had. The survey markers, the water right targeting, the company registered 400 miles away with no visible principals. He watched the room as he talked, some faces showing genuine shock, some showing the particular stillness of people hearing things they already knew. Garrett's face went through 3 changes in quick succession that Cole filed away for later consideration. There's already an inquiry underway, Cole said, which was not entirely true yet, but would be by the time he got to Hartmore's response, and close enough to true that he was comfortable saying it. If there are people in this valley who have been providing information to this company, that inquiry is going to find them. That's not a threat. It's arithmetic. The room erupted, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way rooms erupt when a controlled burn suddenly has more oxygen than expected. Voices overlapping, chairs scraping, 2 conversations happening at once in the way that meant people were alarmed enough to forget to maintain appearances. Margaret raised her voice over the noise. This is exactly why we need unity, Cole. Why we need the valley's leading families aligned and... Margaret. He stood up. I'll stand with this valley against every outside threat it faces. I have for 11 years. I'll go on doing it. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. And the woman I'm standing with while I do it is Eliza Hartwell. I'd suggest the rest of you figure out which side of that you want to be on, because the side that's been running a quiet campaign against a seamstress for the crime of having my attention is going to look considerably worse before this winter's out than it does right now. He walked out. He walked down Sims Street and onto the main road, and he was aware that his hands were not entirely steady, which was information he found interesting. He had been in tenser situations than a parlor meeting, had made harder decisions in worse weather, and yet his hands were doing this now. He put them in his pockets. He went to Hartwell Alterations and knocked. Eliza opened the door. She read his face and said, "Sit down." He sat down in the chair by the stove. She poured coffee from the pot she kept warm on the back of the stove and set it in front of him without asking if he wanted it. "What happened?" she asked. He told her. All of it, including the part about his hands. She listened without interrupting until he was done. Then she said, "Garrett's face. When you mentioned this water right targeting." 3 expressions in about 4 seconds. "He knows something." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup in her hands. "You shouldn't have said that you're standing with me. Not like that publicly, not yet. It gives them—" "I know," he said. "I said it anyway." "Why?" He looked at her across the lamplight and the coffee cups and the quiet that he had come to need in a way he hadn't needed things in a long time. "Because it's true," he said, "and I'm tired of only saying true things when they're convenient." Eliza was still for a moment. Then she set down her coffee cup and looked at her hands, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright in a way that might have been the lamplight and might not have been. "This is going to get harder before it gets easier," she said. "I know it is. I'm not going to ask you to—" "Eliza." He said her name the way he said most things, plainly, without ornamentation. "I know you're not going to ask. You never ask for anything. That's not a criticism." He paused. "But you don't have to ask, all right?" She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind came up and rattled the repaired window pane, his putty, his work, solid against the cold. And somewhere down the street, a door slammed. "All right," she said quietly. And the night settled around them, and the cold pressed at the glass, and the lamp burned on. Hartmore's response arrived 8 days after Eliza sent the letter, which was faster than either of them had expected and suggested that what she'd written had communicated the urgency clearly enough. The attorney was 60, methodical, and had a prose style in letters that was dense with subordinate clauses, but precise in a way that rewarded careful reading. He confirmed that irregular water right filings were a known tactic of land consolidation companies operating out of the eastern cities, that the specific pattern Cole had described, survey markers placed on public access corridors, was consistent with a filing strategy he had seen used twice before in adjacent counties, and that the critical evidence would be the original land grant documents held at the county seat, compared against any recent amendments or additions to the filing record. He also said, in the letter's final paragraph, that if Cole's suspicion about local cooperation was correct, the county filing office itself might have been compromised, and that any examination of records should be conducted by someone with legal standing to demand originals rather than copies. Cole read the letter at Eliza's table on a Sunday morning. Outside, the first real snow of the season was coming down in the slow, serious way that meant it intended to stay. "He's right about the originals," Cole said. "If someone's been altering filings, they've had access to the clerk's office. Copies could be altered after the fact." "Can you get to the county seat before the roads close?" "Maybe. Probably not with a lawyer in tow." He thought about it. "Hector can ride faster than I can right now. I've got a bad shoulder from last week. If I send him with written authorization and Hartmore's letter as legal backing, would the clerk honor that? Depends on whether the clerk is the problem or someone above him is." He folded the letter. "I'm going to send Hector and Jasper both. 2 witnesses are harder to dismiss than 1. He rode out to the ranch that afternoon to brief them, and Eliza spent the day doing what she did when she was worried about something she couldn't directly control. She worked. She had 4 repair jobs queued, and she moved through them methodically, and by the time Cole came back in the evening, she had finished 3 and made significant progress on the 4th. What she had also done, between jobs, was write 2 more letters. One to Tom Croft, laying out clearly and without softening what the water right scheme would mean for his parcel specifically, and asking him to talk to his neighbors on the western section. One to the mine foreman's wife, who was connected to a different social network than the valley's farming families and who had, in Eliza's assessment, more backbone than most of the people in Red Hollow's established circle. She didn't tell Cole about the letters right away. She wasn't sure why. Partly because she was still figuring out what she was building, and partly because she had spent a long time making her own moves without consulting anyone, and the habit didn't break quickly, even when you were no longer operating entirely alone. He noticed the letters on her table when he came in, recognized the handwriting on the addressed envelopes, and said, "Croft, and that's Mrs. Adler at the mine." "Yes." He looked at her. "What are you doing?" Hartmore said the legal challenge needs standing. Legal standing means landowners on record making a formal objection to the filings. You've got standing. Croft has standing. 3 or 4 others do too. She set down her work. Someone needs to talk to them in language that makes sense to farmers and miners, not lawyers. Hartmore writes well, but his letters read like legal documents. They are legal documents, which is why someone else needs to translate. She nodded at the envelopes. Those go out tomorrow. Cole sat down slowly. He was quiet for a moment, and she braced slightly for him to say something about operating without telling him, because men sometimes said things like that even when they were otherwise reasonable. What he said was, "I should have thought of Adler. She's got a sharp head, and she talks to half the operations in the valley through the mine commissary." Eliza let out a breath she hadn't quite realized she was holding. "I know. That's why I wrote to her." Who else? They spent the next hour working through it together, and by the end they had a list of 8 names. Landowners with legal standing, people whose voices carried weight in different parts of the valley's social geography, people who had reason to be angry and the credibility to make that anger matter. It was not an army. It was a coalition, small and imperfect and not entirely certain to hold, but it was something. What happened next was not graceful. The syndicate, or whoever locally was coordinating for them, moved faster than Cole had expected. 3 days after the meeting at Sim's house, the supply wagons that normally ran a weekly route from Garrett's warehouse to the smaller valley operations were suddenly, without explanation, delayed. The stated reason was road conditions. The roads were not significantly worse than they'd been the previous 2 weeks when the wagons had run fine. Tom Croft came into town on a Wednesday in a temper that was barely contained. He tied his horse outside the general store and found Cole in the street outside the feed store and didn't bother with preamble. "They're cutting the supply runs," he said. "Garrett's. I've got an order in for 3 weeks that hasn't moved." "I heard," Cole said. "It's not just you." "It's retaliation. For the meeting." Croft's jaw was set in the way of a man who is running the numbers and not liking where they land. "I can manage 2 more weeks, maybe 3 if I stretch things. After that, I've got a problem." "What do you need most?" "Lamp oil and salt. The rest I can improvise around." He looked at Cole steadily. "What's actually happening here, Cole? Not the Valley Association version, the real version." Cole told him. The full version, Consolidated Valley Partners, the water right filings, Hartmore's assessment, what Hector and Jasper had been sent to find at the county seat. He watched Croft's face move through several stages of processing and come out the other side harder than it had been going in. "My parcel's on the list," Croft said. It wasn't a question. "Your water access corridor is." Croft was quiet for a long moment. A wagon went by, sending up a spray of slush. "That letter the Hartwell woman sent me. She laid it out plain. She's good at that. She's been trying to help this valley for 3 months, and this town's treated her like—" He stopped, started differently. "My daughter's dress. She did that for free." "I know." "I didn't know what to do with that at the time." He looked up. "I do now." He straightened his coat. "I'll talk to Westerfield and the Hanson brothers. They've got standing on the south corridor, and they're not going to like what you just told me." He walked back to his horse and rode out, and Cole stood in the slush and felt something that was not exactly hope, but was its practical equivalent, the recognition that things were beginning to move, and that the movement had a direction. The supply disruption lasted 11 days. During those 11 days, several things happened simultaneously and not smoothly. Hector and Jasper returned from the county seat with news that was both better and worse than expected. Better because the original land grant documents were intact and had not been altered at the source. Worse, because 3 recent filing amendments in the county record showed additions that did not match the originals. Amendments that had been processed through the clerk's office in the past 4 months and bore the authorization signature of a deputy clerk who, upon investigation, turned out to have left his position suddenly 6 weeks ago and relocated to a city 200 miles away. Hartmore, when Cole relayed this by letter, wrote back within 5 days with instructions for filing a formal challenge on the basis of unauthorized amendments and the names of 2 state-level officials who had jurisdiction over county filing irregularities and who were not, as far as he knew, connected to any of the interests involved. Meanwhile, the coalition Eliza had started building was having its own imperfect momentum. Mrs. Adler turned out to be exactly what Eliza had assessed her to be, a woman with a wide network and no particular patience for being manipulated, and she had conversations with people Cole hadn't thought to reach, the mine's equipment supplier, who ran credit lines to half the valley's small operations, and whose good opinion mattered in ways that Garrett's bank didn't entirely control, a livestock broker who worked both sides of the valley and whose information network rivaled anyone's. What none of this was fast, or clean, or certain. The syndicate's hired men arrived on a Thursday. There were 4 of them, and they came in on the road from the north and took rooms at the only boarding house in Red Hollow that wasn't connected to any of the established families, and they made no particular trouble in the first 2 days except to be visibly present in ways that were designed to be noticed. They were large men who wore their guns in a manner that communicated professional familiarity. They rode out to the eastern ridge and came back. They had conversations in the boarding house common room at a volume designed to carry. Cole heard about them from Hector on a Friday evening. He went to Eliza's shop and told her, and she listened with the stillness she always had and then said, "What do they want to accomplish?" "Make people scared enough to stop pushing back. It's a pressure tactic. They're not going to start shooting. That draws the kind of attention that kills a land deal. They just need people to decide it's not worth the trouble." Will it work? Cole thought about Croft's Jaw and Mrs. Adler's network and Jasper Holt, who had survived 3 cattle raids and a range war in his earlier years and was not a man easily impressed by people wearing guns. With some people, yes. Fear works on some people, and there's no shame in that. He paused. We need to move faster on the formal filing challenge. If the state officials have the irregularity evidence in hand before the syndicate finalizes their claim, the hired men don't matter. How long will that take? Hartmore says 2 weeks minimum from the filing date. We're 7 days into the process. 7 days, Eliza said, so we need the valley not to fold for 7 days. More or less. She turned and looked out the window at the main street where the light was going and the cold was coming in, and Red Hollow was settling into its evening routines. What can I do? What you've been doing. He said it simply. Talk to people, not about the legal process. That's too abstract and it takes too long to explain. Talk to them about the winter supply disruption and who caused it and what it means for next season if these people get the water rights thereafter. Make it concrete. That I can do? I know. A pause. Eliza, don't tell me to be careful. I was going to say thank you. She turned back from the window. The expression on her face was complicated. Surprise, a flicker of something unguarded, then the quieter steadiness that was more naturally hers. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He held her gaze. I'm saying it anyway. She was quiet for a moment. Then, very carefully, she said, You should know that when this is over, however it ends, I'm not going to suddenly be someone different. I'm still going to be a woman with a seamstress shop and modest means and no particular standing in this valley's social order. I know that. And you should know I'm aware of what you've given up in the last 3 weeks. Business relationships, credit goodwill, the goodwill of people you've worked with for a decade. I know what I've given up. I want to make sure that this isn't something that feels different later when the immediate crisis is over and you're looking at the actual shape of things. Cole looked at her steadily. Are you asking if I'm going to change my mind about you when things calm down? She didn't look away. Yes. No, he said. I'm not. The word was plain and unembellished, and he meant it in the way he meant most things. Without flourish, without qualification, without the performance of sincerity, because the thing itself was sincere. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, the way she did when she'd received information she intended to trust. The 7 days were not easy. 2 of the families on the coalition list got cold feet after the hired men made their presence felt more directly. A fence cut on Westerfield's east pasture, a curt conversation in the street with one of the Hanson brothers that was technically civil and thoroughly threatening. Westerfield pulled back from the formal filing objection. Cole couldn't blame him. He had 3 children and a wife with a bad lung and no buffer against a bad season. Croft held. Croft held with a stubbornness that came partly from principle and partly, Cole suspected, from the particular anger of a man who had been made to feel small and had decided he was finished with that. Mrs. Adler delivered on every promise she'd made. The equipment supplier had a conversation with Garrett's bank about credit terms that was by all accounts pointed enough that Garrett developed a sudden interest in reviewing his own position relative to the syndicate's local arrangements. That conversation was the turning point Cole hadn't anticipated, because what it revealed was that Garrett was not a true partner of Consolidated Valley Partners, so much as he was a man who had been promised certain advantages in exchange for certain information, and who was now discovering that the promised advantages were looking considerably less certain than they had 3 months ago. Garrett came to Cole on the 12th day, when Hartmore's formal challenge had already been submitted to the state officials and was working its way through the process. He came without advance notice, which was itself a communication. He sat in Cole's ranch office and looked at his hat in his hands and said, "I wasn't part of the filing irregularities. I want you to know that." "What were you part of?" Cole asked. "Information, debt exposure reports on Valley landowners. They told me it was for a legitimate investment assessment." He paused. "I should have asked more questions." "You should have." "I'd like to—" Garrett stopped, started differently. "If there's a way to cooperate with the investigation that doesn't require me to be formally named as a participant, that's not my call," Cole said. "That's Hartmore's and the state officials. But cooperation tends to be considered in outcomes. That's generally how it works." Garrett nodded miserably. He left 20 minutes later. Cole sat for a while after Garrett's wagon was out of sight, and then he rode to town. He found Eliza in the backyard of the shop, splitting the last of her winter firewood in the cold afternoon light. She was not doing it badly. She had clearly done it before. But she was working with a hatchet rather than a proper splitting maul, which made it harder than it needed to be. He took the hatchet from her without asking, selected a proper round from the pile, and split it in 2 strikes. "You don't have a splitting maul," he said. "The hatchet works." "It works worse." He split another round. "Garrett came to see me this morning." She straightened. "And?" he told her. She listened through it with the focused attention she always gave to information that mattered, and at the end she said, "He's frightened." "Yes." "Good." She said it without cruelty, just with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who understood that fear, strategically directed, was a tool. If he cooperates fully, it speeds the state review. "That's what I told him." Cole split 2 more rounds in silence. The sound of the maul, he had found it in the small shed at the back of the yard, hung on a nail that suggested it had been there for years and simply not identified correctly, was clean and sharp in the cold air. "The hired men left yesterday." Eliza looked at him. "All 4? "Rode out north before dawn. Hector saw them go." He stacked the split wood against the fence. "That's usually what happens when the filing challenge is in process and the local support starts to crack. The investment calculus changes." Eliza was quiet for a moment, looking at the growing stack of firewood. "So it's working." "It's working." He picked up another round. "Not finished, not certain, but working." She leaned against the fence post and watched him work, and her face had a quality he didn't see often. Not relief exactly, because she was not a person who celebrated prematurely, but something like the careful loosening of a tension that had been held for a long time. The kind of loosening that happens when you've been bracing for impact, and the impact, while still coming, is going to be survivable. "I owe Tom Croft a debt," she said after a while. "He'd say you don't." "I know, but I do." Cole set down the maul and looked at her. The afternoon light was going flat and golden the way it did in winter, making everything look simpler and more final than it actually was. She was standing in her work apron with sawdust on her sleeve and her hair coming loose from its pinning on one side, and she was the least constructed person he had encountered in 11 years of living in a valley full of people performing their various versions of themselves. "When this is done," he said, "I'd like to have dinner with you. At the hotel. In public." She raised an eyebrow. "The hotel charges considerably for their dinners." "I know what the hotel charges. People will talk. People have been talking for 3 months." He held her gaze. "Let them talk about something we're actually doing." Eliza looked at him for a long moment, and the careful part of her, the part that had learned not to make too much of things, not to reach for what might not be solid, was present in her expression, visible to anyone who knew how to look for it. But so was something else, something that had been quietly building since a stormy October night, when she'd told a cold, dripping man to shut the door because he was letting the cold in. "All right," she said, "dinner at the hotel." He nodded, picked up the maul, and finished the wood. The state officials arrived in Red Hollow on a Tuesday in late January, which was not a dramatic entrance. 2 men in heavy coats on tired horses, carrying a leather satchel between them that contained the formal findings of the Filing Irregularity Review. They went directly to the county recorder's temporary office that had been set up in the back room of the assayors building, because the regular clerk's office was considered a compromised location pending the investigation's conclusions. And they spent 3 days going through documents with the methodical patience of people who do not care about local feelings and care very much about column figures matching what they're supposed to match. Hartmore came in person for the final review, which Eliza had not expected, and which cost him 4 days of travel in poor winter conditions. He was a short man with a gray beard and the kind of focused energy that made him seem larger than he was, and he shook Eliza's hand when Cole introduced them and said, "Your letter was well written, clear on the facts and honest about the uncertainties. That's rarer than you'd think." "I found that it saves time," Eliza said. He looked at her a moment longer than a routine introduction warranted, as if recalibrating something. "Yes," he said, "it does." The findings, when they came, were thorough and damaging. The 3 filing amendments that Hector and Jasper had identified were confirmed as unauthorized. The deputy clerk who had processed them had done so using authorization codes belonging to his supervisor, who had been out of the office on each of the relevant dates and had no knowledge of the amendments. That deputy clerk, now located in his new city and apparently having expected that his relocation would be sufficient distance, was served with a formal notice requiring his testimony and cooperation. Consolidated Valley Partners principals were identified through the state corporate registry as 4 investors, none of them local, 2 of them with prior involvement in land consolidation schemes in other regions that had resulted in civil settlements but no criminal convictions. The investigation recommended referral to state prosecutors on the unauthorized filing charges. Whether prosecution would follow was not certain. These things rarely were, but the referral meant the scheme was officially dead. The claimed water right amendments were voided. The survey markers on public access corridors were ordered removed. Garrett's bank was cited for providing confidential client information without proper authorization. The citation was administrative, not criminal, which was what his cooperation had bought him. It would cost him the depositor's counsel seat and a significant fine. It would not cost him the bank, which Cole thought was probably more lenient than it should have been, but that was the shape of how these things resolved, when they resolved through legal channels, rather than any cleaner kind of justice. Margaret Hollis was not cited for anything. There was no evidence tying her directly to the syndicate's activities. She had been careful, or she had genuinely not known the full extent of what she was adjacent to, or some combination of both. Cole suspected the former. He would never know for certain, and he made a deliberate decision to stop spending energy on the question. What mattered was that it was over. Or rather, what mattered was that one specific thing was over, and the Valley had to figure out what it was going to be in the aftermath. That turned out to be more complicated than the investigation itself. The families who had held Croft, Mrs. Adler's network, Jasper Holt, the Hanson brothers, despite their scare, came through it with something that was not quite pride, but was adjacent to it. The specific pride of people who had been tested and had not broken, which is a different thing from the pride of people who were never tested in the first place and feels different in the body. They knew what they'd done. They didn't talk about it excessively because these were not people who talked excessively about much, but it was there in the way they carried themselves through the rest of that winter. Westerfield, who had pulled back from the formal objection when the hired men rattled his fence, had a harder time with it. He came to Cole in February with a manner that was difficult to read. Not exactly guilty, not exactly defiant, somewhere in between. "I know I didn't hold," he said. "You had reasons," Cole said. "Reasons aren't the same as being right." "No, they're not." Cole looked at him. "You're here now." Westerfield nodded. He had brought 2 loads of lumber on his wagon, unasked for, which he'd heard was needed for repairs to 2 of the smaller operations that had suffered supply disruptions. He spent the day helping with the delivery and said very little beyond what was functionally necessary, and Cole thought that was probably the right amount to say. People find their way back from the things they couldn't manage, usually. Not always, and not without cost, but usually. That was something Cole had taken a long time to understand, and had learned partly from watching Eliza, who did not appear to believe in writing people off permanently, while also not pretending that what they'd done or failed to do didn't matter. She held both things at once in a way that seemed effortless, but he suspected was not. The dinner at the hotel happened on a Friday evening in February, 3 weeks after the state officials' findings were made public. Cole had made the reservation on a Monday. By Tuesday, the reservation was known by approximately 80% of Red Hollow's population, which was not a surprise. The hotel's proprietress was constitutionally incapable of keeping information to herself, a quality that had probably cost her in some ways and served her well in others. Cole had factored this in. He had made the reservation in part because he meant what he'd said about letting people talk about something they were actually doing. Eliza wore a dress he hadn't seen before, dark blue, simply cut, the kind of clothing that managed to look considered without looking effortful, which was a difficult thing to achieve, and suggested skill he shouldn't have been surprised she had. She had done something with her hair that was more formal than the practical arrangement she wore for work, without being the elaborate construction that most women in Red Hollow considered appropriate for public appearances. She looked like herself, dressed up rather than dressed differently, and he found this to be exactly right in a way he couldn't have articulated clearly. He told her she looked well. She looked at him and said, "You combed your hair." "I comb my hair." "Not always." He pulled out her chair, which she accepted without the performance of surprise some women did, just sat down in it as though being treated with consideration was something she'd decided to receive without making a production of it. The dining room was not full, but it was occupied enough that their entrance had been noticed by the time they were seated. Cole was aware of the awareness without making it the point of the evening, and Eliza appeared to have made the same decision because she looked at the menu and said, "The roast. It's what they do well here." "You've been here before?" "Once. My father took me the year the shop opened. He said the occasion deserved it." She set down the menu. He was right. They talked through dinner in the way they had been talking for months, about the valley, about the investigation's aftermath, about practical things, and occasionally about things that were not practical at all. Cole told her something he hadn't told anyone, which was that when he'd been building the ranch in the first years, he had made 3 significant mistakes that had nearly ended the operation before it properly began, and that he had learned more from those 3 failures than from every success combined. Eliza listened and said, "What were the mistakes?" He told her. She asked specific questions about each one, not the reassuring kind of questions people ask when they want you to know they're on your side, but the genuinely curious kind that wanted to understand the actual mechanics of what had gone wrong. By the end of it, he had articulated things about those early years that he hadn't understood clearly until the process of explaining them to her. He thought about what that meant, that a person could know you better than you knew yourself, not because they'd been around longer, but because they listened in the right way. "Your turn," he said. "My turn for what?" 3 things that nearly ended the shop. She considered this seriously. "The debt I inherited wasn't the full debt," she said. "My father had a private loan from a man in the next county that wasn't in the formal paperwork. I found out about it 4 months after I opened. It took me most of the first year to pay it without it showing in the accounts because I didn't want to explain it to anyone, which was probably the wrong decision, but it was the decision I made. What were the other two? I hired a girl to help with alterations in the first year. She was skilled, but she was also stealing fabric. Small amounts. Not enough to notice right away, enough to matter over time. I let it go on too long because I didn't want to be the kind of employer who accuses someone without certainty, and by the time I was certain it had cost me. She turned her wine glass. The third was simpler. I underpriced everything for the first 18 months because I didn't believe people would pay what the work was actually worth. It took me a long time to charge what was fair. Cole looked at her. Do you know why? She met his eyes. Because I grew up watching my father undercharge. He thought it was modest. I think it was that he didn't believe quite that what he did deserved full payment. She was quiet for a moment. I had to learn to believe it about myself. It didn't come naturally. There it was. The thing underneath the steadiness, the thing that explained why she never asked for anything, why she had been so careful and precise about not wanting rescue, not wanting charity, not wanting anything that could be mistaken for something she hadn't earned. It wasn't pride. It was the slower, harder work of someone who had needed to build a belief in her own worth from materials that weren't originally there, and who knew exactly how fragile that construction could be if she let people undermine it. He said, "For what it's worth, I've never once been in doubt about what you're worth." She looked at him steadily, and something in her expression was complicated and real and slightly painful in the way that real things often are. "I know," she said. "That's one of the things about you that I didn't expect." They sat with that for a moment, in the dining room of the Red Hollow Hotel, with other people's conversations around them and the winter pressing at the windows outside. Then Cole said, "I'd like to stop conducting our relationship primarily as a logistical partnership around legal investigations and supply disruptions." Eliza's mouth moved towards something that was not quite a smile, but was the direction of one. "What would you propose instead?" "I propose that you let me come by the shop when I don't have a reason, that we have dinner without a crisis to discuss, that we take the gray mare out together when the road's clear in spring and I show you the east pasture, which is worth seeing." He paused. "And in some reasonable amount of time, when things have settled and we both know what we're deciding, I'd like to ask you properly." She understood what he meant by properly. Her expression settled into something that was steady and careful, and also, underneath both of those, warm. The particular warmth of someone who has protected themselves long enough to know what it means when they stop. "No rescuing," she said. "No rescuing. I keep the shop. Obviously. And when I say a thing is my problem to solve, it stays my problem to solve." "Agreed. With the understanding that you can also just tell me things without it meaning you're asking for help." She considered this, the nuance of it, the difference between those two things. "Yes," she said. "I can work with that." "All right then. All right." They finished dinner. Cole paid for it, which Eliza did not argue about because she had decided that some things were not worth arguing about, and this was one of them. Outside, the night was cold and clear, the kind of winter sky that has no clouds and goes on forever. Stars visible in a way they rarely were, except in deep cold. They stood for a moment outside the hotel in the main street of Red Hollow, which was quiet at this hour, a few lights and windows, the sound of a horse somewhere, the particular settled silence of a small town that has had an eventful season and is now resting. "I'll walk you back," Cole said. "It's 2 streets." "I know." They walked. The snow was packed hard on the street, their footsteps barely audible. A cat watched them from a doorway, and then went back to its own business. At the door of Hartwell Alterations, they stood for a moment with the lamp visible in the window. She had left it burning, the way she always did when she went out, and the cold air very still around them. Cole took her hand. Her fingers were cold outside her glove. She had managed to lose one glove somewhere during the evening and had been too stubborn to mention it, because it was that kind of cold and she was that kind of person. He held her hand between both of his for a moment. "Go inside," he said. "You've lost a glove." "I know where it is. It's in my coat pocket." "Then why haven't you—" "Because I was wearing both when we left and I was going to wait until you noticed." He looked at her. She looked back at him, entirely straight-faced, but with the quality around her eyes that he had come to recognize as the thing she did instead of laughing. "You're difficult," he said. "You knew that at the gate repair." He did laugh then, which was not something he did frequently or easily, and it came out rougher than intended, and she smiled. A real one this time, not a near miss. And the lamp in the window burned on. He kissed her once, briefly, in the cold street in front of the shop she had built from a dead man's debt and her own 2 hands, and she kissed him back without drama or performance, the way she did everything, with complete attention and no wasted motion. Then he walked back to his horse, and she went inside, and the door clicked shut, and the light stayed on in the window. Spring came to Red Hollow the way it always did in that valley, reluctantly, in fits and starts. 3 warm days followed by a frost that killed the first green shoots, then warmth again, then the slow, definitive melt that meant the season had finally committed. By April, the roads were passable, and by May, the upper pastures were open, and the valley was doing what valleys do when you give them enough water and enough time, which is produce. The Consolidated Valley Partners case moved through its legal process at the pace of legal processes, which is to say slowly and with considerable paperwork. The deputy clerk cooperated fully in exchange for reduced charges, which provided the documentary evidence that closed the case against the company's principals. 2 of them settled civilly. The state prosecutors were still deciding on the third when summer arrived, and the valley had other things to think about. Cole and Eliza rode the east pasture on a Saturday in May, with Flint and Cole's roan side by side on a trail that ran along the upper creek, and the morning was clear and the grass was coming in thick from a wet spring, and the air smelled like soil and distance. She had never seen the east pasture before. She had seen maps of it, had heard Cole describe it, had helped plan logistics around it. But maps are not the same as standing on the ridge where the valley spread below in its full extent. The creek catching the morning light, the farms and ranches small from that height, the entire geography of the last 8 months visible as a single coherent thing. "It's bigger than I pictured," she said. "Most things are." She looked at it for a long moment. From here you could see the Croft place, the wisps of smoke from the morning fire, the Hanson Brothers fence line running straight east, the Assayers building on Red Hollow's main street, the roof of a small shop squeezed between 2 larger buildings, 2 streets off the main road, which she could not actually see from this distance, but knew the location of the way you know the location of things that matter. "My father would have liked you," she said. It came out simply, without calculation, the way the true things sometimes did. Cole was quiet for a moment. What was he like? Careful, patient, stubborn about wrong things and flexible about right ones. She watched a hawk work the updraft above the ridge. He worked hard and charged too little and never stopped being surprised when people were unkind. He thought better of people than they usually deserved. She paused. "I used to think that was a weakness. I don't anymore." "What changed?" "I did." She didn't look at him when she said it, kept her eyes on the valley below. "This winter changed me some. I came into it thinking that the best I could do was survive on my own terms without needing anything from anyone. I came out of it thinking that's a lonely way to be right." She turned to look at him then, and her face in the morning light had the quality it sometimes had, open in a way she didn't always allow. "I needed things from people this winter. I needed Croft to hold and Adler to talk and Hartmore to write back quickly and you. I needed all of it. And the world didn't end." "Asking for help doesn't mean you're weak," Cole said. "I know that intellectually. Knowing it in your bones takes longer." There was a truth in that worth sitting with, the distance between understanding something and actually living differently because of it. Most people spend years in that distance, circling back to the same walls they thought they'd gotten past, discovering they have to learn the same lesson in different weather before it actually sticks. It doesn't mean the first learning was wasted. It means some things don't give themselves to you all at once. Cole had his own version of it. 11 years of keeping his distance from people who wanted things from him, and somewhere in that careful self-protection, he had also kept distance from things he actually needed. Connection, someone to tell things to, the particular sustaining quality of being known by another person without having to perform anything. He had called it preference. He was no longer sure that had been accurate. "I asked Hartmore about the water right protections," he said, "for the valley. Whether there's a legal structure that would make this harder to attempt again. Eliza looked at him. And? He thinks a formal water rights covenant, signed by the significant landholders, registered at the state level rather than just county, would create a complication for any future attempt to challenge access corridors. It's been done in other valleys. He paused. It requires cooperation from most of the significant landholders, which 3 months ago I wouldn't have thought possible. And now? Croft will sign. Hanson Brothers. Jasper. Mrs. Adler's got her name on enough operations in the valley to matter. And you'd be surprised, after the investigation findings came out, even some of the people who were on the wrong side of things are now very interested in being on record as protecting valley rights. He shrugged. People adjust their position when the wind changes. It's not the same as having held the position all along, but it's still a body on the right side of the line. Westerfield? He's going to sign. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Have you told Hollis about the covenant? Cole looked at her. Not yet. Tell her first, before the others know about it. Give her the option to be part of it before it's a done thing she's being asked to join. She met his eyes. Not for her sake, for the valley's. If she signs early, it brings 2 or 3 others who follow her lead. And it costs you nothing except the conversation. He considered this. It was the kind of thinking that didn't come naturally to him. Not the strategic part, but the part that accounted for human pride and how to work with it rather than against it. He had the instinct to corner people with the truth. She had the instinct to give people a door they could walk through on their own feet. Both were right in different situations. I'll talk to her, he said. Eliza nodded and looked back at the valley, and they sat on the ridge together in the early morning, the horses patient beneath them, the hawk still working the thermals, the whole valley laid out below like something that had been waiting, not for them specifically, but for whatever it was they represented. People willing to do the slow work. People who understood that what you build by hand and keep by stubbornness is worth more than what you're handed. They were married in August, in the small yard behind Hartwell Alterations, with the back gate that Cole had rebuilt properly the previous October standing solid on its repaired post, and the window above the work table sealed against drafts with putty that had held through the coldest winter in 6 years. Tom Croft was there, and Jasper Holt, and Hector and Denny, and old Mrs. Adler, and a collection of valley families who had made their own reckonings over the winter and come out on the other side of those reckonings changed in ways they were still working out. Hartmore attended. He had driven 4 days and seemed entirely content to have done so. He brought a wedding gift that was a bound copy of the final state filing on the water rights covenant, which was either the least romantic gift at the event or the most, depending on how you looked at it. Cole thought it was the most. Eliza agreed. Margaret Hollis sent a card. She did not attend. Cole read the card and set it aside and thought that this was probably the correct resolution for that particular relationship. Not reconciliation exactly, not ongoing enmity, but a kind of mutual acknowledgement that both parties had shown their character clearly and would now proceed with that knowledge. The world had room for that kind of ending. It was better than most. Red Hollow did not transform overnight. Small towns do not. The people who had been unkind to Eliza did not all become kind. Some of them adjusted their behavior because the social wind had shifted and adjustment was in their interest, and some of them maintained a distance that was in its own way honest, and a few, over time, actually reckoned with what they'd done in the way that requires genuine discomfort and comes out the other side as something real. Mrs. Pemberton at the dry goods was one of the latter. She came by the shop in October, almost exactly a year after the storm, after the coat repair, after all of it, and stood at the counter and said, in a voice that had clearly been rehearsed but was still difficult, "I treated you unfairly. I knew it at the time, and I did it anyway." Eliza looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said, "you did. I'd like to, if you'd be willing to restore the credit arrangement." "That's not necessary," Eliza said. "I pay for things now. It works fine." Mrs. Pemberton absorbed this. "I understand." She left. Eliza watched her go through the shop window and then went back to work, and the account of that exchange settled into the town's ongoing conversation in a way that was neither triumphant nor punitive, just honest, the way a town's shared memory is honest about what happened when it can no longer afford to be dishonest. Cole asked her about it that evening. She apologized, Eliza said. I acknowledged it. That's all? That's usually enough. She turned the seam she was working on toward the lamp. I'm not interested in punishing her. I'm not interested in pretending it didn't happen. Both of those things can be true at once. He watched her work for a moment. The shop was warm, the stove ticking, the window solid against the October wind. His coat, the same canvas duster, or rather not the same one because he had replaced it in spring, but this one too had been repaired twice already by the woman across the table, hung on the hook by the door. I talked to Denny today, Cole said. He wants to start his own operation. Smaller scale, up the North Corridor. Good for him. He'll struggle the first 2 years. Every new operation does. I know. She glanced up. We should have him for dinner before the freeze. Make sure he knows what resources exist in the valley that he can actually call on. A pause. And that it's acceptable to call on them. Cole looked at her. She had said we should without any particular emphasis, in the same tone she used for practical observations about seam allowances and weather conditions, and she hadn't noticed that she'd said it, which meant it was just true. Just the way she thought about things now, in the plural, in the coordinated sense, without it requiring a decision. He had wondered sometimes whether this kind of thing happened, whether two people could find their way to this particular ease without one of them losing something essential in the process. He had seen versions of it that weren't this, versions where one person's ease was purchased with another person's diminishment, where the comfort of togetherness required someone to be smaller or quieter or less than what they'd been. This was not that. Eliza was, if anything, more fully herself than she'd been the night he'd dripped sleet on her floor. The shop was expanding. She had taken on an apprentice girl who was learning fast and asking good questions. She had been consulted 3 times in the past year by Valley families negotiating agreements, not because she'd asked for that role, but because people had noticed how she thought about problems and wanted access to it. She had not stopped being careful. She was still not someone who announced herself or pushed into rooms she hadn't been invited into. But the careful had changed quality. It was no longer primarily defensive. It was the careful of someone who knows their own weight and moves with intention. He was, he understood, a better person for knowing her than he had been before he did. Not dramatically, not in ways that made a good speech, but in the practical daily sense of being someone who listened better and assumed less and allowed himself to be known by another person without flinching from it. That was not nothing. In fact, over the long run, he suspected it was the thing that mattered most. More than the ranch, more than the water rights covenant, more than whatever legacy Red Hollow would eventually assign to that particular winter and what came out of it. The lamp burned. The wind pushed at the sealed window and found no purchase. Across the table, Eliza worked a seam straight and true, the way she had worked everything in her life. With patience, with skill, with the quiet, undemonstrative persistence of someone who understood that the things worth having require being built by hand, in the dark, over time, without guarantee. Outside, the valley settled into its autumn, the same valley it had always been, changed and unchanged, going on.